All right. I think it's time to get rolling. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Toby. I lead the business development team at Briink. Welcome everyone to our webinar together with Raise Capital and South Pole on challenges and best practices for private market investors around the PAIs. We're really excited to welcome you. There's a couple little housekeeping rules I wanted to go through just before we get into it. So first and foremost, this webinar will be recorded and we will be sharing the recording after the fact, so you're able to view everything afterwards. You can leave any questions you have, and we really encourage you to ask questions, since that's sort of the point of this webinar, to really be practical for you. In the Q&A function of Zoom, please do that through the Q&A function, not the chat function. Of course, we will be looking at both. We, in all likelihood, are not going to be able to get through all of the questions that are asked today, since that is the goal. So there will be questions left over. We will make sure, together with South Pole and Raise, to follow up with you after the fact and make sure any and all questions are answered. Final point, we're going to, at the very end of the webinar, so that's after the question and answer session, leave the speaker's contact information up, so that if you have any follow-up questions, you can ask them directly, or if you'd like to pick up contact. So with that in mind, I think it's time to hand it over to Ben to introduce himself. One other point I would mention, we also have Shreya Mehra, an SFDR specialist from South Pole, who will be looking and going through the chat or the question and answer function to answer any questions you might have in writing that we don't cover verbally today.
Great. Thank you, Toby, and thank you to our panelists for joining today, and thank you to everyone in the audience. There we go. Just go through the run of show for today. I will start with a quick introduction to the PAIs, just to level set on knowledge, really providing contextual understanding for how the PAIs fit into the broader spectrum of ESG regulatory regimes and ESG data collection for investors. We'll then hand it over to our panelists, Danielle and Blandine, who will provide insights into PAIs in practice and integrating PAIs into the investment process. And just a quick introduction, Ben Howard-Cooper, Head of Sustainable Finance at Briink. I'll pass it off to Blandine.
Hi, everyone. Blandine, and the Head of Impact at Raise, which is a 1.5 billion private market platform based in France.
And Danielle.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Danielle. I lead our regulatory team within the sustainable finance practice of South Pole. At South Pole, we focus on both consulting services and climate projects. And I'll leave it there for now.
Great. Thanks, both. Today's conversation is really dedicated to actionable tips around the PAIs, but just spending a couple of minutes to, again, contextualize why we're all here. Looking at the EU Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, we can see that there are a number of regulatory regimes that have been set up specifically for financial market participants and for corporations, which all aim to support a broader market around disclosure. Providing information on sustainability metrics provides comparability and allows capital to flow to truly sustainable projects. For today's conversation, we will focus mainly on the issues facing financial market participants in relation to the SFDR, or Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, although none of these conversations can really happen in a vacuum, so we will certainly touch on NFRD and EU Taxonomy as well, as those fall into the larger concept of ESG data collection. SFDR requires a certain level of disclosure at both the entity and product level. Today, again, our conversation will be focused mainly on the product level, with a focus on Article 8 and Article 9 funds. Article 8 funds, which support ESG initiatives, and Article 9 funds, which have a specific sustainable objective, both of which are required to report on PAIs as a matter of disclosure, so that investors and other stakeholders can truly understand the sustainability profile of the underlying investments. When we look at the PAIs, we see that they're broken into three core categories depending on the underlying asset, with investee companies, real estates, and sovereign and supranationals having different sets of metrics that need to be reported. There are 14 mandatory for investee companies and additional 17 optional, which need to be selected in order to present in the PAI reporting. similar concepts for both real estate and supranationals. Today's conversation will really be focused on an analysis of these data points, how to collect them from investments, and how to report them back to regulators and other stakeholders. Now, time for some polls. We will be sending out a quick poll to all of our attendees in the audience, and we will be showing the results after the panel discussion. So please take a minute here to answer the poll. Just another couple of seconds here to gather the data. Okay, great. And again, we'll show the results of the poll after the panel discussion and before we jump into the Q&A. Great. And with that, let's dive right into it. Maybe I'll turn the first question over to Blandine. Blandine, it would be great to hear about how Raise integrates PAIs into your investment process, and maybe if you want to share some challenges for the audience.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ben. So I think that for us, the way we kind of looked at PAI was a bit of a two-step approach, because we already had existing kind of ESG integration with our investment process. So the idea was for the first step, at the very least, to kind of understand, what those PAIs were, because definitely not all PAIs are created equal. They have different goals, different things. And so that was the first step. And so when we looked at the PAI, we identified kind of three big categories of PAI, what we call the exclusion PAI. So these are indicators that very much relate to our exclusion policy or to practices that we would want to avoid. So for example, fossil fuel exposure, because we're an Article 9 fund and we very much had that exclusion on, or other kind of exclusion related to, biodiversity, negatively impacting, biodiversity. So this is the first kind of category. The second type of PAI for us were what we call the process PAIs. So these are indicators that are actually about, do you have a policy or do you have a process type of question, or the way we translate it for our portfolio companies would be through that lens. And so those are more what we would consider areas of improvement. We invest in SMEs. So for most of them, we invest when they're still, their processes are still not really structured. And so we're very much there. This is our added value, supporting them through structuring their process is why also we come and support them. So this is more areas of improvement. And then the third type of PAI is what I call the performance PAI. So indicators such as GHG emission or gender pay ratio, where broadly speaking, you'll have a bit of a hard time. There is no clear cut. This is the answer that I want. You can't really say I want that as a GHG emission. That would be a bit of a tough kind of call. You also know, by the way, that if we stick to GHG emission, it is likely that because the companies are going to grow, this is an indicator where technically their performance is going to become worse and worse. They are going to emit more GHG emissions. So for those kind of indicators, what we wanted to do was more of how can we help you improve? And this is why we very much consider them performance. It's more of a discussion in terms of how they can improve down the road. And so the second step then, once we had this kind of internal in-house classification, was, well, where does this different indicators, this different PAI, complement our existing ESG integration approach, and where can we sort of integrate those indicators within our investment process? And so for the exclusion PAIs, or what I call the exclusion PAIs, it's in the name. It's negative screening. We want to have the information as soon as possible, and we want to avoid it. So that's kind of, due deal pre-investment as soon as possible. For the process PAIs, well, I mean, I can ask an SME, they have a policy on, sustainable agriculture. Arguably, it's quite unlikely that they'll have it. Some do, but it's a fairly rare kind of acquaintance. So for us, this is very much indicators that we use during the holding period, and as a bit of a toolbox in terms of kind of action that could be included within the action plans that we have. So as part of our ESG process. We define ESG action plans, and we support companies in improving their and implementing those action plans. So this is kind of where they're at. And then the final kind of type of PI indicator, which is the one that personally I was the most intellectually interested in, which are what we call the performance kind of PI. There, it's an integration that starts during due diligence. Basically, we try as much as possible to collect a baseline prior to investing. So we try as much as possible to have a GHG emission so that we can then have the conversation during the holding period with our portfolio company around setting targets for improving their performance, with very much an approach where you, unfortunately, because we do not have benchmark data, and especially, sector data for SMEs, we won't be able to tell them, well, this is where your market is at. But hopefully, down the road, we're going to be able to set targets that are way more meaningful for them, because that allows them to see where they're positioned against their peers. Right now, it's more of a big picture. We want gender equality, so your pay ratio should improve. We want more GHG intensity, so you should improve that. So that's more of a broader kind of target setting for those companies.
Great. No, thank you so much for that, Blandine. Really interesting stuff. And I think maybe as a follow-up question, I think we all know there's an ongoing conversation in these markets around the use of proxy data versus company reported data. And thinking about the three buckets that you just mentioned, it would be interesting to hear your perspective on sort of best efforts in gathering data directly from portfolio assets versus just going the proxy route.
Sure. I think, well, as I mentioned, when it comes to controversy or what we call the exclusion, PAIs, I think those are data that you can collect directly from the company. It's likely that if they have no exposure to fossil fuel sector before investing, they are likely to not have any exposure during time. So you keep on collecting the data, but it's very much something that stays kind of, it's an example of an indicator or of indicators where I actually ask my investment team colleagues rather than ask the company, because they're at the board of directors, so they know whether those kinds of things have changed, and we know that they haven't. So that's kind of the way we approach for those. It's kind of directly from the company through the lens of our investment team. In terms of the process, we do ask this question, or the process indicator. We do have integrated arguably some of those processes within our ESG questionnaire, our annual ESG questionnaire. And that's actually data that it's, from our perspective, or at least from my experience, fairly easy. Companies know whether they have a policy or a process about something or not. So it's a kind of yes or no type of question that makes the data gathering process fairly easy for them. I would say it's long because there are a lot of them, but at the same time, it's not too complicated a data to collect. You'll just have usually a lot of conversation around, what are the PIs, what are the policies and the processes that apply across your portfolio versus those that apply to a specific sector. I was mentioning sustainable agriculture. We have companies in our portfolio that are part of what we call the agricultural transition. So for them, that's very relevant. For other types of company, it will be a very, pointless kind of question to ask them. So, it's always more complicated, but I think that there you'll have also a bit of a general versus sector specific type of divide. And then for the performance indicator, I think this is, very much where you were pushing me, Ben. So I'm gonna go for it. We do ask, and we do seek, at least at Raise, to collect that data from our portfolio companies. If we go back to GHG emission, because I think this is kind of one of the one that we very much all see, or at least it's one of the most palpable ones. Scope 1 and 2, actually, we the way you calculate scope 1 and 2 emission, you actually can have, or that's our experience. Companies know how much they spend in electricity and therefore how much they consume in terms of electricity. Same with gas, same with a lot of those energy. So going back to a bit of the financial statement, you will find somehow that information, and they will have that information. Where it gets very tricky is very much scope 3. So what we do is scope 1 and 2, we know that we can collect that data. Scope 3, well, we seek to collect that data. We very much have this question in this conversation. I think I'd be lying if I were to tell you that 100% of this scope 3 are, actual gathered data. There are proxies in there for us. Also, because sometimes when you have this conversation with the companies, just the process of gathering data is going to take them, 7-8 months. And so you will have missed your reporting deadline. So there is also a bit of an effort around time to collect the data versus the value that it adds to you and to the company in terms of the way they monitor their performance. But, once you go beyond kind of this GHG emission where proxy, where you do have this allocation, when you're talking about, for example, gender pay ratio or board diversity, which is what we call, performance indicator, or are in that same bucket, you very much do not need to use proxy data, or at least it is our experience that they can share that data. When you're talking about injuries, when you're talking about days lost because of accident, those are the kind of things that you usually can provide. So we're investing, in European SMEs. So there is an element of regulatory kind of, they have to do it anyways because they're mandated to. So that may make it a bit easier, but arguably for, quite a fair bit of those kind of performance indicators, you can find the data. It's something that they do have.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think those are really insightful, and I'm sure our audience really took away from hearing about the way you're approaching it, since Rays really are market leaders in this industry. Maybe as a follow-up question, you talked a little bit about how to think about the PAIs less as a silo and integrate them into your ESG questionnaire and your broader ESG data gathering initiatives. I'd be interested to hear how you work effectively with your portfolio companies. It seems like Rays has done a really great job of humanizing some of these questionnaires, making the base data points really understandable. Would love to hear some tips that you've developed over time on how do you bring portfolio companies on board when they're bombarded by these ESG data requests?
Sure. I think I was browsing through as you were asking me the question, the Q&A section, and it was one of the question was around how do you do with different definitions? I think that initially our hope was that thanks to the PAI, finally our portfolio company would have a section of ESG questionnaire that would be the same across all GPs, because we're minority investors, so we do have we're frequently not the only investor. And so we're co-investing with others. And so they always, company always had several questionnaires. And so we're hoping that at least for the PI, we would all have the same questionnaire. And interestingly enough, because of the difference in definitions, not necessarily. So it was initially, we thought it would be a kind of, it will allow company to reduce a bit their collection effort, but not necessarily too much, actually. So that being said, I think the way that we try to support companies, and I think it goes back a bit to the internal kind of classification, was around very much understanding the different types of PI, looking at what are the ones that are material in terms of the business of the company. I think not all PAI makes sense for all company. There are very much some that definitely apply, some that don't. So kind of in terms of, it was also around trying to be a bit, and it might not be the exact right term, but a bit flexible in terms of sort of collecting that data and understanding we can ask the question around 14 indicators. Honestly, we've got 100 plus data point in our ESG questionnaire. 14 more or less isn't going to necessarily change too much the exercise. The idea was to use also those kind of questions to first try and streamline things. So to not necessarily add question, but to slightly change definition and slightly change data points that we're collecting to try and make, lower the burden. The second sort of way we approach it was very much, you get to say those PI are not applicable to you. By the way, even if they are mandatory, we'll just consider that you for example, if you say mechanism, of compliance with the UNGC are not applicable to me, I'm going to consider that it's because you don't have them, and I'm going to have a conversation with you as a company as to what it is, what it means, and what we can do to help you, implement those. And I think that this is kind of, the third bucket. And relating to the second time, the process type indicators. Once again, I think as investor, we can very much support our companies in improving their performance and in, defining and structuring their policies. So we do have templates of the different types of policies and processes that they can implement to be compliant with the PIs, or at least to answer some of those PI questions, knowing that those PI kind of indicator around processes are going to be a percentage of your portfolio that has the types of policies. So it's, once again, it's a bit of a wide bucket, and you can kind of have a fairly different types of practices within that same indicator. So that's also where we've tried and support them, is very much giving them the resources, so that if they say, no, I don't have it this year, they can say, yes, I have it next year. And so, for example, we're talking about proxies on scope 3. We very much give them resources to try to go from proxy to actual scope 3 data. So that's then, kind of, I think, the beauty of private equity. You're an investor for a significant amount of time. So you have this option to share resources, to support them, and to help them improve performance.
Very, very clear. And I think, it's quite obvious that Raise is far along in their ESG journey, that you've really established robust ways of thinking about this data, integrating it into sort of everything you're doing in the investment process. For those in the audience who are maybe less along on their ESG journey, do you have any key takeaways, any pieces of advice for those who might just be starting the PAI data collection process?
Sure. I think, the first step that we had, I think, is a step that is applicable to everyone, which is basically have a look at those PIs, see how you would classify them, what you would use them for, try and understand how that might translate for your portfolio companies. I think once you've done that key step of sort of having a bit of a vision as to what you want to do with those indicators, how you will integrate them or how you will collect them might become easier. At least that was the case for us, because it helps you, for example, say, well, as part of the voluntary indicators, do I want to collect all of them? Do I want to collect some of them? Which are the ones that are relevant to my investment strategy and to what I want to do with portfolio companies? We mentioned different type of definition. It also can help you sort of set your own definitions, or at least have your own kind of appreciation for what you think that indicator means for you, your strategy. I'm not telling you not to read, the fine prints of the PI and to not, abide by regulation, but I think there is an element of interpretation. And I think that this is where also there are, kind of things that can be really interesting and that can, once you have your interpretation of those indicators, I think that the data collection might be a bit easier, because then you see, well, those are questions I can ask my investment team. They actually know that. Those are questions I definitely need to ask to the company, but maybe it will be more relevant to have a bit of a call with them, because, there is, I want to be able to understand more broadly their practices, or this is the type of indicator that I want to set targets at fund level or at company level in terms of where I think their performance should be. And I think that this is, a good way from my perspective to kickstart the process. And maybe just one thing, we're kind of lucky enough nowadays in 2023 to have very much like a fair bit of available data collection platform. So you can also, by the way, make yourself, your own life easy, and just select the platform that will give you, that will help you at least with the entire infrastructure. Because I haven't mentioned it, but the infrastructure behind data collection and data analysis is always something that is quite, not is always, but can be something that is quite burdensome if you don't have the right tools available.
Thanks, Blandine. And certainly the point on tools really resonates with me. I think, one observation that we have at Briink is really how important it is to make sure that you've set up a environment where you can collaborate and go back and forth on these data points. ESG questionnaires, I'd be interested to hear from you, Blandine. How many times do you send an ESG questionnaire and you get it back immediately with no back and forth? The very concept, I see you laughing, the very concept of ESG requires this collaboration across broad stakeholder groups. And so finding platforms and technology solutions where you can really do that work together, make sure that you're getting this process done effectively. And I think we've really seen a great uptick in portfolio asset and portfolio company buy-in into this process by using technology tools, taking them away from another Google Sheet or another Excel, making it simple and, really bringing them into a user interface that they can understand. Does a lot of work. So glad to hear that resonates with you too, Blandine. I see a ton of questions coming in. Don't worry, we're going to have our Q&A in just a bit, but I really want to start a conversation with Danielle from South Pole. And maybe Danielle, Blandine did a really nice job explaining what's happening directly at Raise, but I think with your perspective broadly across markets, it'd be really interesting to know sort of how your clients are using PAIs and maybe the same question that we gave to Blandine. What are the main challenges? What are people struggling with?
Yes, thanks, Ben. And thanks, Blandine, for all your comments. A lot of what I'm about to say will actually very much echo what Blandine has highlighted. And I would say there's three main challenges. I tried to really summarize it. When I first brainstormed, it was a list of many more, but condensed it to about three, which is lack of data. This won't be new to anyone. Second, the overburdening of investment companies. And third, the continuing change and evolution of the PAIs and more broadly, the SFDR regime, leaving out all the way it interacts with the EU Taxonomy and some other EU legislation. Well, to start with the lack of data, the familiar one to everyone here, but I think to further unpack that, there's multiple reasons. And the first and foremost right now is that a lot of financial sector players and the companies that they finance are out of scope at this point. In fact, I suspect that most of the PE audience here doesn't even have to report for the upcoming June deadline because few funds have more than 500 employees. But of course our investors do. So we are all sort of caught between, okay, there's a legislator that doesn't yet require me to report data, and yet my investors do. So that's one reason, which will diminish over time, but that's where we're now. So a second reason is that, and Blandine, you said this so well, not all PAIs are made equally. Some are very clearly defined and scoped, such as the GHG emissions one. That's one where we as South Pole have a lot of experience, and yet still when you get to that scope 3 question, it does get complicated. So even that most clear one, where there is most data out in the field, is quite complicated once you look under the hood. And then there's some other PAIs, such as the emissions to water, that still beg a lot of questions regarding their meaning, their scope, and their methodologies. And no one's really clear on how that should be done. Third reason of this lack of data is, and Blandine, again, you mentioned this, not all PAIs are equally relevant to all investors. Now, there is some distinction between regular investees, real estate, and sovereigns, but yet I think there could have been more guidance for different asset classes, and then for different sectors, some will just not be relevant. Hazardous and radioactive waste might not be relevant, or is likely irrelevant for a fund that invests in software and professional services firms. So then should we go through the hoops of requiring best effort data collection when the answer is going to be non-material, very likely? So it is a messy data field, at least for the time being. And so what we do is to navigate those unavoidable gaps. As we all know, the legislation allows for estimations, contrary to the EU Taxonomy. This was good news. And in addition to proxy data, we can also rely on expert inputs on further research. Again, there's a question on what further research means, but there's a lot of interpretation and possibility that can go into that. And then there's, of course, third-party data. And so at South Pole, we help with this process and ensure that it is, most importantly, all transparently communicated what goes into that best efforts to fill those data gaps. So that was one challenge. Sorry, I'm only in 1 out of 3. Ben, please cut me off.
No, go. This is fascinating.
But the second was the overburdening of investment companies. And again, Blandine, you unpacked this very nicely, but we see, especially in the PE space, there's investment. Most investments are in smaller and growing companies, which have enough on their plate and already get enough reporting obligations, ESG or otherwise. And now an additional issue with the PAIs is that there is a request for an average of 4 reporting periods over a year, whereas currently most of our clients only send out sustainability questionnaires once a year, if at all. So there, again, what helps is to map in advance what's most material, what's most relevant, and what's already in place. Often across sustainability reports, public or private, across annual reports and other disclosures, there's already a lot of information that can be either used directly or multiplied with other inputs. Actually, tools like Briink software help in that analysis of all that information. But I'm not sure if you'll speak to some of your AI-powered solutions, but that is actually a really nice answer to the need to map all of the information that is out there and right now scattered across documentation. So then moving from my second to my third challenge, it's the continuing evolution. And so when the PAIs were released in 2021, there was actually a lot of industry feedback with concerns about the length, the technical detail, and the lack of clarity in some of these metrics. There's been a gradual evolution towards GHG emissions disclosures, but then there are another 14 to 18 mandatory indicators that were never required before. So that's a lot to suddenly ask from the market in 1 to 2 years. But despite these concerns, there have been very minor changes made. And so now with the first report due in June, it's quite unlikely there will still be an overhaul of the PAI. So let's assume these are final. It's still the case that some lack that clarity. And of course, no one wants to do this best effort work if some standards and expectations might still change. So what we try to do is just keep an eye on the market and give our best understanding of current market practice and the regulatory guidance. And then another thing is to proactively analyze also how some of these PAIs touch on other frameworks of disclosure, such as TCFD, CDP, and the EU Taxonomy, so that any work done and perhaps no longer required or perhaps slightly changing in the future doesn't go to waste, to say so. So yeah, these are the 3 main challenges we see. And again, this might have been a bit of an echo of what Blandine already said, and I'm sure they'll be recognized by the audience as well.
No, I think your perspective, seeing sort of broadly how the market is responding to these, is really interesting insight. And in some ways, I think everyone in the audience who's struggling with this should walk away with maybe a little bit of a sense of comfort, knowing that these pain points are not unique to a specific fund or a specific investor. Everyone is really struggling with this. And it's not just the mechanisms of collecting the data. It's something as basic as just understanding what are they asking for here, which creates a lot of usability issues. But I think also creates a really interesting opportunity for first movers to set the standard, because there are so many questions and so much gray area here. The more that you can justify the approach that you're taking in the market, sort of the more that you will set standards, and there'll start to be a calcification around some of these approaches. And maybe as a follow-up question on that approach, Danielle, it'd be interesting to hear sort of how you think about setting up systems that can collect this data effectively. And to your point earlier, make sure that you're not asking the same question 100 different times in 100 different ways for 100 different frameworks. Like, how do you think about this more holistically?
Yeah, really like that question. And well, first point there is indeed that one entry point really makes a big difference. We've the PAIs are relatively new for all of us here, but we've been working on the EU Taxonomy for a couple of years now, and just the difference between how we work now and at the very beginning when it was, shopping around Excel sheets across different teams with our clients. The majority of our time went to managing that process rather than inputting and getting right data. So seeing a lot of software tools now come out that facilitate that multi-user access and that easy aggregation of all the data. That's been hugely helpful. And then second, before sending out any data requests, really mapping what's already in place and what's relevant and material to the company. And then really tailoring data requests to that specific investee. That's really key to get a response that's meaningful and in any subsequent engagement and conversation. So those are some of the best practices we've seen so far.
No, and I think it goes back to the point that you made earlier around finding platforms that might use cutting edge technologies like artificial intelligence, because I think one observation, and I know this will resonate with Blandine, is ESG reporting is not the job. It's a part of the job, but it's increasingly taking on more and more time, meaning there's less resources and capacity to do the impact work that I think brings people into this sector. And so being able to use technology solutions to speed up delivery of these reporting processes is critical. And I think one of our observations at Briink is really, these NLP models, these AI models that help extract evidence and help do the reporting also help create that sort of auditable trail. And Danielle, you were saying earlier, the interpretations are changing. 1 year it might be observed this way and the other year that way. And so creating that linkage of this is why I made the decision I made, this is why I'm presenting things in a certain way, really becomes mission critical as you look sort of in the out years.
Yeah, 100%. And actually something we often say in our team is much more important than the numbers now are the footnotes underneath the numbers. So what is your data source? What's the methodology you've used? Just being very transparent on how you got to those numbers. And right now, yes, that is often a footnote. It's making sure you link everything up well, and a lot of that process can be sped up by data linkages and evidence trails that just make it very easy and smooth to find that evidence. And in the end, we all need to be very mindful of that transparency. As long as there are those questions outstanding, transparency is key, and making it easy for any reader to find that evidence and follow.
Oh, exactly. Well, look, I think I've hogged up enough time asking questions. Time to turn it over to the audience. I know there's quite a bit of enthusiasm to ask some questions. So, Toby, over to you.
Yeah, there have been a lot of questions, which is good to see. And again, we're not going to be able to get through all of them, just given the time, but you will be receiving follow-up unless you haven't sent one anonymously, unless you have sent one anonymously, in which case we won't be able to follow up with you, but just let us know. Otherwise, I wanted to start actually just by sharing the results of our poll at the beginning. So we should see those in front of us now. So it looks like first and foremost, data availability is the main challenge that funds face for question number one. And for question number two, most funds are in progress and have some of the PAIs measured, but not all.
Interesting results. I think those really mirror the conversation we were just having.
I'm very glad to read there's a 14% with full measured PAIs. That's a better result than expected. So.
It's all of Blandine's colleagues on the line.
Yeah.
I think we're actually, like, in all fairness, I suspect I would say we're in progress. Some are measured, some we're still chasing people.
With that in mind, I wanted to jump into some of the questions that have been asked. This is one that was asked multiple times. We're going to be, by the way, doing these chronologically, just in fairness. First and foremost, where and how do you source proxy data for PAIs? And Blandine, I know you already touched on that a little, so I thought maybe I'd hand that question to you to start.
So I'm going to give kind of the fun perspective, and I'm sure that Danielle will have a bit of a better sort of, I can share, she has data sources that are probably better than mine. No, we just use the proxies that are shared by our ESG platform. So where we have our ESG questionnaire is, structured through a SaaS platform, and they offer the option to use, to share, Scope 3 proxies. Those being based on a methodology. I don't want to mistake myself, but I don't want to say mistake, but I think it's a Yale methodology of like carbon accounting and estimates. But broadly speaking, I think that's kind of sectoral-ish Scope 3 estimates. And that's maybe more of a question for Danielle. But my understanding is that those are not necessarily too hard to find. Once again, we actually have the ability to do proxies probably a bit more easily for GHG than for other indicators, such as exposure to, human rights violation within supply chain, for example. Like that's a proxy I'd love to have, but haven't have. So.
Indeed, I agree. It varies very much across the PAIs. There seem to be more and more third-party data providers. The usual data providers have a lot of information based on their, more public companies, from which it's sometimes quite easy to comparables for smaller companies. And yeah, in the GHG emission space, this is a very common practice for investors. It often depends on the type of investor and the portfolio size, but we very often use top-down estimations and proxies. The level of granularity varies, and you always try to get sort of the closest to accuracy, but that depends on the size of the portfolio typically, and practical matters. Scope 3 is always the one where most proxies are required, and we do that through emission factors. We have emission factor databases that feed into that. If any further technical questions on GHG, the three first PAIs, happy to answer those in more detail after the session. We also have Shreya on the line, as was mentioned before. In addition to the PAI, she also works on our GHG and finance emissions accounting. So happy to follow up there.
And maybe just to add, as far as using proxies in this process, for those who are focused on investments in the SME market, proxies become a much more difficult beast. If you're looking at large listed equities, there's plenty of proxy data out there for you, right? You can sort of pick and choose, but those numbers don't tell the best story for SMEs. And I know, Blandine, this will resonate with you. Sometimes we're asking the wrong data points from companies because it's just not telling the real impact story. And so proxy data with SMEs becomes a whole other challenge in and of itself, but plenty we could discuss on that.
A couple of questions here coming from VCs, especially those in an early stage. How do you manage data collection for the PAIs for pre-seed or seed investments? And Ben, I know we've been working on that, so I might hand it to you to kick it off.
Yeah, look, I think it really touches on the points that both Danielle and Blandine have made, which is don't think of the PAIs as just another compliance checkmark exercise. If you go into trying to engage with an SME with that mentality, you're going to walk away with an empty sheet because so much of these data points are just not relevant to this size or maturity of business. And so really taking the advice that was shared here today is, integrate this into a broader concept of ESG engagement. How am I thinking about the data points that I want to collect for this firm? How am I building a narrative around what this company is today? But more importantly, where is it going? How do I think about sort of the full evolution of this company when it is sort of outside of its growth stage? What will its sustainability profile look like? How can I use the PAIs to start measuring some of that baseline data now so that I've got a good comparison later down the road? I think so much of this SFDR and broader EU sustainable finance picture has been dedicated to large listed firms, to public equities. More of it has been focused on SMEs as well, but there's really little out there for some of these more seed stage startups who are more in the funding game than anyone else, right? They're constantly going out and engaging with investors. One observation we've had is that startups who can go into those meetings with a very clear picture, not wait for the investor to come and ask them for PAIs or SFDR or EU Taxonomy or any of those ESRS data points, but can rather go to the investor and say, I've done my due diligence. I've incorporated these concepts into my business. I'm ready to present you with the data. That's one less thing for you to have to do, Blandine. I think that goes a long way in generating a comprehensive conversation.
Maybe just to add into it, another point from one of the VCs who asked a question is, can you recommend any sort of light touch approach to begin gathering this data without necessarily gathering all of it at once and putting too much burden on the portfolio companies? Danielle, you've unmuted, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, we actually have a nice example of a recent engagement where we had to do that. They are a very early stage VC investor and started out with lofty ambitions of all the PAIs and some voluntary ones and some EU taxonomy work as well. And then a couple months in realized this is completely unrealistic and also have no legal obligation this year yet. And so we ended up completely shifting our approach with them towards a more engagement-focused one. So as opposed to now, the objective being to disclose quantitative information on every PAI, it's much more a story of engagement and a story of a future approach on every PAI, and a story of why certain ones are relevant and why others are less so. And so that's been, we discovered over the course of this, much more useful in their narrative towards their investors and in their conversation with their companies than going in like, we need this list of items. So it was really we sort of found out three quarters into the work, but it's been a really nice sort of mindset shift for all of us. So.
Dean, you've unmuted. I was about to ask you a question, but I'm going to let you go. I'll let you go.
No. I think I was actually going to echo what both Ben and Danielle said around sort of first, you'd be very interesting as an investor, just understanding what are the ones that are relevant for that specific, startup, and down the road, once it will be a bit bigger, will it be relevant, and how will it be relevant to them? So I think that's kind of a good first example. And then I also think that, there are a fair bit of conversation that you can kind of have, or at least indicator PAIs that you kind of need to translate for a startup that are actually very interesting to translate. So I'm going to use an example because we're very invested into gender equality at Raise. Our position is we always want a kind of a duo of a man and a woman working together. That's kind of our setup throughout function. So we're like 50-50. But when you're talking about board diversity, I think it's a good thing where you're like, who are the co-founders? What is that relevant for them? How would you want to kind of, having those conversation around their team and around, who's in front of you, that's actually, it can be very, you need to translate that for a startup, but that's not necessarily an interesting kind of question to ask or a lens to look at when you're talking to startups, how they feel about their management group and how they want to, where they want to take it, what are the things that, the skills or the diversity that they want to have or not. And so back to what kind of Ben said, I think there is a real element of kind of just also sort of structure and thinking about where you want the company to have, and more of it something that a data that you want down the road, and not necessarily the thing that the check the box exercise that you need right now of like, you don't have a board, how am I going to disclose board diversity? Which are like, there is a way to kind of make it a bit more relevant for hopefully everyone around the table.
Next question, just because we're coming up on time. So we have about 7 minutes to go here. For the harmonization between frameworks, which PAI data points do you think are going to be easiest to copy and paste into other disclosure schemes? I have a follow-up question to that, but I wanted to start actually by handing it over, Blandine, to you again, since you've mentioned that you have a very large questionnaire. And that the PAIs is one portion of it. How are you approaching the replicability of that evidence and data?
So I think I'd argue we're kind of lucky because it's an easy thing to harmonize, with the PAIs, because your LPs are going to ask them, that it's likely that at one point or another it's going to be part of some type of company level disclosure regime, or at least if we're all collectively, the year goes trying to harmonize its own, kind of frameworks, it should be down the road. So for us, it wasn't, when you're looking at the mandatory, for example, indicator with the 14 indicators. Most of them were already in our reporting framework. So it was, I'd argue, an easier harmonization. Where we've had a bit of an exercise was more around how do I translate the fund level kind of indicators into indicators that I want to put in my company level framework. And I'm sorry if I'm getting a bit technical, but there are some questions that are very much useful at portfolio level, but that will bring limited value or are not necessarily indicators where company will have a lot of information. I'm going to use an example. We were having last year, so we started last year. Last year, we had a question for a portfolio company, which is, are you close to a biodiversity sensitive area? And every company said, no, of course not. We're far from all of them. And then we screened them through IBAT and found out that all of them, not a single one of them, was not within 50 kilometers of a biodiversity sensitive area. So what they were actually trying to tell us, which is fine by us, was that they don't have an activity where they negatively affect biodiversity. They're actually closer than they can think, to these areas. But so I think this is where, or an example then of how do you harmonize their framework? That is, the IBAT screening I can do on my own. This is like a free platform. I don't need anyone else because I know where, their sites are. So the question you don't necessarily need that harmonized at portfolio level kind of framework, but you need that at fund level. So I don't know whether I answered the question, but I think you need to go back basically to just having a bit of a look at the different PAIs, classifying them based on what they're trying to achieve, and then seeing how you want to integrate them into different assessment and analysis frameworks you might have.
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think on face value, you might look at the environmental ones as being, these are the ones that I can transfer across, right? Everyone is going to ask you for your GHG emissions, water emissions, these things that are important. But I think if you dig a little deeper, in fact, there are a lot of opportunities to take some of the policy questions that Blandine has been referencing and use those across all your reporting. So if you look at the taxonomy, for example, all of those do no significant harm principle policies are very much integrated into the PAI. So as you're starting to gather some of that data around biodiversity policies, water policies, you're really starting to accomplish a lot of the work that has to be done on these other regulatory regimes as well. And I think the policy work is oftentimes some of the hardest, right? You have to integrate meaningful policies into these organizations and ensure that they're really living up to these policies. And so, if you can use sort of a combination of these different regulations that are all speaking about the same thing, you can really accomplish a lot of efficiencies.
Thank you, Ben. So we're coming up on the end here. Before we go, I wanted to ask one last question. It's a very big question. So it's certainly, not quite enough time to answer, but it's been asked repeatedly in the chat. How do PAIs relate to or tie into the broader frameworks of the EU Taxonomy, the CSRD, as well as the SFDR. Those are three very separate things, but I was hoping maybe to start with Danielle and just hear one or two thoughts on how these are all interrelated.
There's the very long and technical answer, and there's the shorter one. And in the interest of time, I'll stick to the shorter one for now. But broadly speaking, we see the EU taxonomy as, from a fund's perspective, as an emphasis or as an indicator of what's truly and deeply greenest. Whereas the PAIs are really more of an adverse impact measurement. Now, of course, there's a lot of overlap. So within the EU taxonomy, we also have a do no significant harm check. The PAIs look at do no significant harm as it relates to Article 8 and 9 in a different way as well. So there's a lot of questions outstanding. Those have also been asked to the European Commission to clarify some of those linkages. But overall, the guidance we give is really one ultimately has the objective of establishing what is most green, and the other is what is harmful on a fund level. On the short term, we think the PAIs will be most informative to investment decisions, or we hope so, as we move our economies away from harmful activities to neutral and ultimately to that very dark green. That's where the EU taxonomy will start driving more decisions down the line. But the EU taxonomy, and I know we're at time now, so I'll stop there. It has even more data challenges than the PAIs as far as we see now. So that will be more in the midterm that really starts to drive decisions, although we hope to see it sooner. So
we're at time, but so far not many people have dropped off. Blandine, I'm going to hand it to you for a quick last word.
No additional question, or just a last word. Right? No, I was just going maybe to follow up on what Danielle was saying, or at least our philosophy. We're trying to use the PAI as proxy for do no significant harm assessment. I think for the taxonomy, you've got clear do no significant harm for the environment, but as Ben mentioned, actually you find that the minimal social safeguard do kind of echo some of the PAI questions. So you do find kind of sort of some echoes. So I think that generally, and that will be my actual last word, Toby, is that, all those frameworks and generally the PAIs or every other framework, the way we try to approach them is by first asking kind of what were their objective, what were they trying to achieve, and to understand kind of rather than the letter of the law, a bit more of a spirit. What were they intended to do? Because the way that everything has been drafting, for having seen that from up close, it was a rush. Everything was done very, very quick with a lot of things to kind of get out in a very limited amount of time by a very limited, team in terms of size. And so I think that there you going back to the spirit of the law will allow you at the very least to have a bit of intentionality, and we're an impact fund. So that's very much important for us to have intentionality in terms of what we want to use those frameworks and those tools for within our investment process, within our just practice.
One last note, if I may add, because we didn't link to the CSRD just yet, and I think it is good to note because there's a hopeful note there. Hopefully, from next year onwards, there will be a lot of disclosure requirements on companies coming through there. So that hopefully will fill the field with more data from the ground up. And we've been looking through some of the CSRD technical standards, and a lot of those fully overlap with the PAIs. So there's a promise there.
Great. So I'm just sharing our contact information here for everyone that's spoken today. You'll also see there's been some really great answers coming from Shreya in the chat. That's my final word. Ben, is there anything you'd like to add before we end the webinar?
No, I really liked how Danielle ended it on the positive note. And maybe just to echo all of this again, don't treat this as a compliance exercise. Really think about how to integrate this into your broader mission around impact or around measuring risks. You don't have to be an impact investor to use these tools effectively. You can be a regular investor who integrates ESG risks into their considerations, and these tools are just as effective. This is not a gotcha exercise. The regulators intended in good intentions, to have this actually drive impact, to have capital flow to the right projects, to allow businesses to understand what their risks profiles are, what their impacts are, and use that as a starting point. You're going to come into conflicts with certain data points. Don't let that hold you up. Push through those, justify the way you're doing it. And the last pitch, of course, find the right tool to help you do that.
So thanks everyone for joining. That's the end of our webinar today. Thanks especially to our esteemed panelists, Danielle and Blandine, for taking part today. As I mentioned before, the questions that are as of yet unanswered will be answered, I promise. All of us between Briink and South Pole and Raise are all going to be taking some time to answer those questions. We really look forward to hearing from you. If anyone does have questions, especially coming from Blandine and Danielle, who've really shared some of their expertise, please don't hesitate to reach out to them, as well as to Ben or myself, if you're interested in PAI and taxonomy reporting. So thanks again to everyone, and I believe that marks the end of our webinar.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.